And I work this, do I? I click. Brilliant, there you go. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Phil, and I'm the chair of JT, so we're going to talk lots about broadband, blah, 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 as I keep hearing. But just a little bit of a background as to where I've come from and generally what I've done in my life. I've spent roughly a third of my life doing one of these three things. So I started a business in the media industry straight out of university, so I've never actually technically worked for anybody. Built the first digital news agency, and then spent 10 years running news agency businesses around the world. And then I quit all that because somebody had a wacky idea about dialing up to the internet, and we started a business called Demon Internet. And those are people who are old enough may well remember those days of us putting CDs on the front of techie magazines so that you could dial up to the internet. These days, what I do is I work with a whole bunch of companies, usually with a technology bent, and most of them are private equity backed. So I partner with a lot of private equity companies that look a little bit like the guy on the right there, and deal with a lot of bankers, which is great fun. It's really good fun. I didn't want to talk about technology too much. We just heard from Andy from IBM, and he sort of flagged up some of his interesting technologies. But I thought I'd give you just a quick splat of stuff. These are the technologies that I am spending most of my time with at the moment, in various roles and in various sort of contexts. But they're all fundamental shifts. So every single one of these is going through a moment in time, so a transformation in various different ways. And they're not applications, they're not end use cases. These are technologies that are fundamentally shifting and changing what they're able to do, almost at the physics level. They're not things that somebody's come up with a wacky new idea to make some money or to launch a new business or create a new application. These are things that are genuinely having groundbreaking innovations. And so they're causing waves, and they're attracting huge amounts of interest and investment. And I'll just pick a couple of them. And actually, I'm going to talk about blah, blah. I'm going to talk about fiber. You wouldn't expect me to do anything else, really. But I'm not just talking, when I get involved in the fiber world at the moment, I'm not just talking about broadband. In fact, that's probably one of the most boring use cases for fiber at the moment. One of the companies that I'm involved with, which actually is a spin-out from Southampton University's photonics department, which is a great source of these kind of businesses. There's at least two that I've been involved in that have come out of Southampton University, is playing with creating fiber with an air duct down the middle. And the reason we're doing that is because light travels faster through air than it does through glass, by about 50% more. And if we can get a 50% more advantage on transmitting data through air core fiber, then that makes a big difference in financial trading situations, as an example. Another use case that we're playing with, and in fact, a company called FiberCore. So one of the interesting attributes of fiber is that you can put coating on it, and glass changes its properties depending on the temperature or the gaseous material around the fiber. That changes the characteristics of the glass. We can measure that, and therefore we get things like thermal sensing and gas sensing fiber. And in fact, we've got about 2 kilometers of our glass sitting on Mars at the moment, on the Mars lander, doing gas samples to work out what gas content there is there. And one of the most recent applications for that, and an idea we had, was to, rather than in data centers putting little temperature sensors in each of the racks to spot thermal problems or power consumption problems, is that we can lay a continuous stream of glass fiber around the data center, and we get a continuous monitoring point. So if there's any gaseous emissions, water ingress, or temperature anomalies, we can spot the exact point in the data center where that's happening. So rather than just being a load of point sensors. So some of this fiber technology is getting really, really interesting. And its applications are huge if we can get some of this stuff right. We've heard a lot about AI. I won't bore people with it, but I do want to touch on one of these a little bit more in detail. And I think Andy did himself a bit of a disservice. The picture on the left, I showed at a presentation for, actually, I think Kevin's leadership thing in 2018, which at the time was IBM's quantum computer. And it looked a bit like something that you'd see in the 1960s in a sort of lab environment where people were playing with early stage computers. And they called that the IBM Q. That's their quantum research computer. And one of the things that they'd done is they put that on the internet, and if you're a programmer, a little bit like me, you could actually log on to a website and write quantum code and play with this thing that's in metal racks on the left-hand side of this screenshot. 3 weeks ago, IBM released the production version of that, which is the thing on the right. Now try buy one, that'll be interesting, but that is their production version 1 of the IBM Q quantum computer. And they've built that out of Japan. And that's not a myth. So when Andy was saying, it might be coming sooner, that's because they already have one with a price tag on it. And this is a fundamental change. I can't begin to describe how fundamentally different way of thinking and writing code and running computers this technology represents. This is right at the cutting edge. To go to the other extreme, if we take a really boring technology, this is the internet, and I won't bore you with lots of stats about it, but just to sort of update everybody on where we stand at the minute, about 66%, about 2/3 of the planet is now connected to the net. About just over half of that, so roughly 53, 54% of that, of the people are in Asia. The US accounts for about 7% of the globally connected community, and Europe accounts for about 15%. There is still 40% of the population in Asia to connect who still do not have access to the internet. In the US, it's about 5%, which is, to be honest, is getting to the point where it's just saturated. And in Europe, it's about 12%. One of those is my house in Yorkshire, which is currently still on satellite, but we won't go there. And the rate at which people are connecting has slowed down dramatically in the USA and Europe, and is increasing dramatically in Africa and Asia. And if we think about the internet today, and I think about the early days when we were messing around with it, it was America and the UK people who were playing with this technology. And now we're a tiny pimple. We're a tiny pimple on the internet. And we think of it as a Western technology, and it just isn't anymore. It just isn't. Interestingly, current forecast, there will be about 75 billion devices connected to the internet in the next 5 years. And when we talk about the Internet of Things, just understand the size and the scale of that growth. There's roughly about 30 billion today, roughly, just dumb devices that are connected to the net. That's going to go to 75 billion in the next 5 years. So one of the reasons that JT got into IoT, and Graham's here, so he can talk much more eloquently than I can about IoT, is because of that phenomenon, that next wave that's coming. We're all sitting in here with smartphones and iPads and watches and all sorts of things. All of those things are quietly talking to the internet, downloading updates, playing with apps, sending data back. All of that stuff is going over this fabric. And it's dwarfing what we do as a human population on the internet. It's dwarfing it. It's a huge area of growth. And of course, what we do with that, and that fundamental rollout of connectivity, has changed the way that we behave. And I don't need anybody, you don't need me to tell you that Facebook and social media explosion has happened. 2/3 of the internet is now using social media. To be honest, 2/3 of the internet is now using Facebook. Facebook's ARPUs on their latest financial results were at $39 per user. Now, to put that in context, that's 3 times their closest rival. They now control over 1/3 of the global advertising market. 1/3 of global advertising goes onto Facebook, just one platform. And you can look at the stats. 90% of people who read something on Facebook and it comes from another human trust it. Whereas if you walk past a billboard in the street, only 14% of us believe it. There is a company in Brick Lane in London that I know quite well, whose only mission in life is to write peer reviews of products on social media. So they have about 400 people in an office, and the marketing director of Marks and Spencer's walks in one day and says, look, I've got a nice red dress that I want to shift. And 400 people immediately start writing reviews on Facebook and Instagram and all the rest of it saying, look at this wonderful red dress and how good it is and how great it is. And that's the world we live in today because we've connected that many people together. And it's got even worse than that. The iPhone 13. The iPhone 13 was launched last week. And I've already met at least 3 people in this room who said, oh, yeah, I was waiting for one. It's actually not that much better than the iPhone 12 or the iPhone 10. I mean, it really isn't. But if I look at the adverts, it's all about the sleek design and the nice aluminium and the nice fancy glass, and look, it comes in purple. You know, we've got to the point where some of this technology isn't about the technology anymore. It's about how it fits in as a fashion statement. And if you're old enough and can remember the launch of the original iPhone and the queues that used to sit around the block for a computing device, a telephone, for God's sake, just masses of people waiting to get all their hands on it. And it would be remiss of me to not mention COVID. It would be bad of me not to mention COVID because the impact has been profound. You know, we've already seen and we've already talked about, you know, how we all picked up our laptops and went home the next day. I mean, in reality, about 40% of the workforce literally went home and carried on working. You know, we'd all had laptops with cameras in them. We all had Microsoft accounts. We all were able to log onto Zoom and play with Teams. And we just flipped. We just did it. And prior to that moment, I don't think anybody had really turned on the video camera on their laptop. I think most people would have looked at it and said, what the hell was that for? And I remember people sitting there putting pieces of tape over it because they were afraid that Zuckerberg was watching them. You know, I mean, really. So, and I don't think any of that was by design. There wasn't any, I don't remember, I mean, I really don't remember sitting in any board meeting that had pandemic on the risk register. Or any IT director coming in and saying, do you know what? If we all have to go home, we can do it. We can absolutely do it. Because we just got on and did it. And the problem is we can't put that genie back in the bottle. I sit on 8 boards at the minute, big and small companies. There's probably about 12,000-ish people that represents. And I've been in board meetings most of these last 2 weeks. It's just that time of the month. And in every board meeting, we've talked about offices and return to work. None of those companies, none of them, have said they're expecting any more than 30% of their workforce to come back to the office. Just not happening. One company that we were having a conversation with the HR people tried to mandate that they wanted people in 1 day a week and said to their workforce, you must come into the office 1 day a week. And there was an active rebellion. How dare you tell us to come into the office 1 day a week? And then the debate around the board table went something along the lines of, well, hang on a sec, we're paying them all this salary, and that used to cover their trouble for coming into the office and their travel. So maybe if they're not coming into the office, we can cut their wages. And you can imagine what they're thinking. Okay, you either come into the office 1 day a week, or you're going to get a pay cut. That's not going to fly. So I don't think we can ever put this back in the bottle. I think what we're going to see is a completely different way of working going forwards. I think we've already weaponized an entire workforce from, you know, the very early stage career people right the way through to the old guys like me, with weapons-grade technology and video conferencing equipment and software to be able to do this forever. And what the office then looks like, and whether it's a collaborative workspace and we all throw out the desks, is going to be the next big debate. And I think it's going to be quite profound. It's going to be a real fundamental shift. Now we shouldn't be surprised by that, to be honest. I'm old enough and been around long enough to have met actually some of these people. So the guys on the left, Thompson and Ritchie, for those who don't know them, it's Thompson and Ritchie. These are the guys who created the C programming language back in the 70s, which is what Unix is based on, which is pretty much what the internet's based on, and pretty much every device in this room is based on. And I still have my C programming manual, for those who, some techies over here, I think. My C programming manual, my white C programming manual, signed by Dennis Ritchie, which is just one of my treasured possessions. These guys were university researchers. And they were government funded in America. And their ideas and their thoughts about how to open up computing and to open up programming so that it was easier for people to get access to and allow them to distribute their work to other researchers was a fundamental principle of what they were doing. And it was driven, A, by their own sort of views on how these things should work. You know, more brains on it, the better we're going to get. But it was also driven by a tax system. You know, the American taxpayer was paying for this research, and one of the requirements in the US when you get funding in a university is that your research has to be published and made available. And when you're writing computer software and operating systems, there isn't really an easy way of making that available other than by putting it on a computer and letting people have access to it. So they built a system to do that. And that's really where the early stage internet came from. And for those of you, again, who are old enough to remember these things, the old FTP server networks and things that you could download all this code from. Because it was all about sharing the ideas and the concepts. And they had some groundbreaking ideas. You know, prior to this, computer systems were big monolithic rooms that had, you know, usually blue, that had specialist engineers who carried a soldering iron. You know, these guys said, well, we can just write software that does little tiny jobs, and you can make big things by putting together little tiny jobs. And that's what they did. They wrote little tiny things and made the Unix operating system a collection of little tiny tools that you piece together, which empowered a whole pile of community people, because they could all write their own little tools, and they could put them together in different ways. You know, when I was growing up and learning, going through my coding days, it was easy. I could download this stuff, I could modify it, I could play with it, I could put it together. And that is fundamentally what's going on inside all of this internet technology. You know, remember my house in Yorkshire? I said was on satellite broadband. Well, Graham will smile at this. About a month ago, I finally got my own fibre into my house. I had to register myself as a telecoms company. I had to apply for code powers from Ofcom. I had to arrange for a 20-kilometre fibre dig, contract the people, the OpenReach people and the Thales people who dig up roads, get all the wayleaves. It took me 18 months, but I now have 22 kilometres of glass fibre that I own in a duct, dripping into my house, and if I pull it, something in a shelf in York falls off. And I used a few of my little connections, and I've now got an optical path that goes all the way from my house through to an exchange in York, all the way down to London, and straight into the London Internet Exchange. And I've got a 10 gigabit connection on that, and that's just what I wanted, which is about the same, and connected in the same way as Hull is. But it has taken a lot of time. But that's, you know, when I think about the broadband blah, blah, blah comment, I don't think you understand what you've got here. I really don't think you understand what we've got here. It's taken me 18 months to get roughly the same service in my farm in Yorkshire that you have everywhere here. And the open and simple point is that I can create a new bit of the internet, my house. And you know, it is a new bit of the internet. Just by plugging it in and conforming to a set of standards. And then all of a sudden, there's a new bit of the internet there. And that's why it's spread. That's why it's so easy. That's why it's easy for us to pick up things like a laptop, take it home, plug it into the broadband, and it just works. Open standards, common platforms, simple, easy connection systems. That's why it spreads. And the world ends up looking like that. This is actually a graph of Facebook connections that Facebook released that just showed the viral nature of how people's friendship groups come. You can challenge about data privacy and people looking through your friends list to draw nice pictures, but anyway. But that's how they see the world. That's how these people saw the world. It's just a big place where everybody wants to talk and share ideas. But the problem is the world really doesn't look like that. It's actually a little bit more complicated than just this lovely place where the internet spreads. Because the world looks like that. And people have borders and customs, different cultural beliefs, different intents, different languages, different currencies, different tax regimes. Just in that map alone, there are at least 3 wars going on right now. I mean wars, not trade disputes. I mean, this is people with guns killing other people. And what we're trying to do is to overlay the nice rosy picture on top of something like that. And not everybody thinks the same way. And I get involved in a lot of these security conversations in various ways, and here are some of the things that we're talking about. Now, at the moment, if somebody goes in and sort of messes around with your website or posts something on your social media feed, it's a bit annoying, right? I mean, it's pretty frustrating. But some of this stuff gets really serious really quickly. And some of the outcomes of things like increasing physical harm outcomes, the train that is being controlled by a signaling system that somebody hacks into and then crashes. Bits of software, ransomware, injected into systems that take power grids down, happened in Ukraine. Data that's not just stolen because, guess what, it's got a load of credit cards and addresses and phone numbers in it, but where people are going in and modifying health records so people get the wrong drugs. One of the top right one is a current concern and a really very real one. And I don't know if you know a lot about this world, but if you discover a bug in some software, so say you find an exploit in an iPhone operating system, you have 2 choices. If you're the guy who's found that, you can ring up Apple and you can say, guess what, Mr. Apple, you have this problem. And Apple will pay you for that. There's a market rate for if you ring up Apple and you say, we found this, they rate the exploit on a scale and they pay you money for reporting it to them. That's choice number 1. Choice number 2 is you can go to zeroday.com. And zeroday.com is a marketplace where you can say, I found an exploit, and I'm the person who found it, and nobody's ever heard of this before. And people will then bid for your exploit. And at the moment, you can probably get roughly 10 times the value that Apple will pay you by putting it on this website marketplace. Now, eventually Apple will see it, and eventually Apple will fix it. But what we call a zero-day exploit is that today, the bug is unknown, so it's day 0. It will probably take 30 to 35 days for Apple to find it and fix it. And it will take them another 30 to 60 days to get it rolled out onto people's iPhones. And the commercial value of your exploit is dictated by that window, that day window. And people will value it. There is a formula for calculating how much people will pay based on the severity of the bug and how long it will take Apple to fix it. And there are traded sites today that you can do that on. And they're legit, and you can go and look at them, and they're all there. They're not on the dark web or anywhere. This is a legitimate marketplace. So some of this stuff gets really nasty really quickly. And it gets even worse when you start looking at state actors. Now, this is it's not live now, but it was recorded live. It's just a little movie clip or something. This is some stuff, because one of the things I used to do was to run Cable and Wireless, which runs the 4th largest global network for transatlantic cables. And this was data that we got and digitized through a company called North. And this is real time. I mean, this was literally on a screen in front of me being recorded. And this shows you attack vectors. So this shows you attacks, source and destination in real time, what's going on across the world on the big internet cables that span continents. And you can see here, I mean, it's a war, and it's 24/7. And these are not, this is not some script kiddie sitting in his bedroom. This is state-sponsored mass computing platforms attacking other nations. And if you look at some of this stuff, if I was a bad actor in this place, and I could take 10% and consume 10% of the traffic of all the SME sector's websites in a particular economy over the next 20 years, that would slow down economic growth in that country dramatically. And that's that. That is what's happening. And if you look at it, it's not one way. And interestingly, if you're techie enough and you care about this stuff, if you look at the attack types column, you'll see that the biggest attack vector is email. That's port 25, SMTP email. That's spam to you and me. So again, if I can flood all the SMTP servers, all the email servers in a particular country, and just fill people's inboxes with spam, or slow down the amount of speed at which email transports, over 20 years, that's going to have a dramatic effect. And this is going on right now, as we stand here right now. You can see this in real time. And our institutions are struggling. I can launch a DDoS attack or a SMTP ingress attack in a matter of minutes. I can deploy 80 million IoT devices in a bot network within the hour. The average time to pass EU legislation over the last 15 years has been 90 months. 90 months to deal with this sort of stuff. How we put the technology world and insert it and overlay it into the real world is a real problem, a genuine problem. And yet here in this room, I have infrastructure, I have government, I have people and skills, all in one room. And this is probably one of the only places on earth where I could get stuff done by standing up and speaking here to this audience. If you really set your mind to it, would it take you 90 months to solve something? And don't forget, this isn't just about electronics. This is not about stuff with a plug in it. Most of the personal wealth that's coming out of people like Bezos and crowd over in the US at the moment is going into this space, which is about extending human lifespan. And they've got targets of 100-year lifespans. And there's a lot of work going into how do you try to replace body parts, how do you do biochemical engineering to try and extend life and replace aging cells, and this is massive, massive amount. More money going into this research than there is into any other research in California right now. Huge. There isn't a single multi-billionaire in the US who hasn't seed funded one of these types of companies. Calico is one of them. It's one of the oldest ones. So it's not just about plugs. When we talk about technology, don't just think about plugs and electricity. When I'm talking to businesses about all this sort of stuff, the one thing I always say to them is, when you're thinking about how do you exploit this, how do you take advantage of all this change, whether it's the technology waves that are coming or the trends that are taking place in the world, and be that the way that people are using these technologies for good or for bad, what you're looking for is corks on rising tides. So when I play with my own money and I invest in businesses, I try and find businesses that have got a good product, are growing well, able to support themselves, viable, but their product or service is sitting on a rising tide. So the big trends that are happening in the world that are driving the value and driving momentum and driving growth. And I'm not going to go into them because otherwise we'll be here forever, but just sort of the things that we think about. So when I sit there with the big investment houses, and I spend a lot of time with, as I said, with private equity, these are the four things that repeatedly come up. If you look at economics, we're talking about a third of the world's GDP going from the west to the east over the next 30 years. A third of the world's GDP. The consequence of that is that 6 out of 7 of the current largest economies in the world, under our current definition, will change to be emerging in that timescale. That is huge. And then you have to stand back and say, one of the things that we're wrestling with is a thing called high-risk vendors. where I've got a lot of pressure and a lot of regulatory direction and policy about removing Chinese equipment from networks and removing it from software stacks and generally trying to buy from the West. Well, you look at these kind of tides and you have to say, this is interesting. We've talked a little bit about the technology stack. I've given you some of my thoughts on that. But look at the resources and population. I just want to dive into that and just briefly sort of look at sort of things that we're thinking about. That is the global population chart. Okay, that is the current UN median forecast. So that's the middle path forecast for population growth on the planet. Global population's grown from about 1 billion to about 7.7, I think it's 7.8 as of yesterday, when I looked, in just the last 200 years. Just the last 200 years. The current estimate on our current way of living and the way that we use land and that we farm food and we transport goods is that the planetary capacity is about 11 billion. UN stuff. That's the UN median forecast. It's due for a revision, and it's likely to come down to 10. That's what all the indicators are at the moment. Now, you can worry about what happens when we hit 11 or 10. But the point is, as we start to approach these limits, we start to see other things happening. Resource constraints. You can expect things like food riots, mass migrations, the breakdown of law and order. I mean, these things will happen when we get to these kind of limits. And so we have to do something about it, somehow. I'm not going to bang on about sustainability and the green agenda and all the rest of it, but just some facts to put it in your head. That is the CO2 emission. That is the graph of CO2 emissions as we can measure it today. And it's the IPCC data. It's not tainted anyway or some hidden agenda. If we hit the top right, that's somewhere between a 2.4 and 5 degree increase in global temperatures. Just, ballpark. Which the best models we've got today say 1.2 to 2 meter sea level increase. Now, at that level, Europe mainly doesn't exist. The UK is basically a small island. My house is underwater, that's for sure. And to put it in some context, the current reductions target that the UK has signed up to is trying to remove that white area. And we're already a third of the way into that journey. And I don't think there's a cat in hell's chance we're going to get anywhere near that. Even if we turn off the fuel supply. And all the annoying people who've bought EVs and are now laughing at me back home at the minute and feel great about themselves are still contributing to the problem. And this stuff is going to drive policy and agenda and intervention if people don't do stuff. And it's not just a bunch of people sitting on the M25 or getting in sailing boats and sailing across the Atlantic. This is fundamental changes that are going to impact every single person. Every single person. Everything is going to be dictated by these kind of stats. These are big rising tides. We have lost 20% of the Arctic surface in the last 30 years, and prior to that, we'd never lost a square kilometer. And the global energy forecast, so the demand for global energy, rises by 48% in the next 30 years. And Europe is 25% of that demand. 48% increase in global energy consumption. Doesn't matter where it comes from, 48% increase. These are huge changes that are going to affect everything we do. And it's not just about, whether the sea goes up or the electricity bill happens or the fuel doesn't arrive or whatever it is. It's changing the way people think, particularly coming out of the pandemic, attracting skill set, recruiting people, retaining them. People start to think about these issues, ethical issues. They like to know about data privacy. They like to know about your sustainability agendas. They like an honest and transparent conversation and dialogue with the business. And that plays to the skills point. And when you get to talk about people, what does a business have to do in those kind of environments? And I always say to people, and I always try to think this way, is that companies have to reassess their position in light of some of these changes. It's not just technology, it's all about the general business environment they're operating in. Is there sustainable value in the business? Is there a natural place in the ecosystem, and how does that change over time? And you know, we at JT, we've got a big sustainability agenda, and one of the conversations that we have repeatedly around the table is it's not about JT being green. That's great. We'll reduce our CO2, that's fantastic. But it's how do we maintain JT as a relevant organization in 30 and 50 years' time? How does it have a sustainable place in the ecosystem? What does it do in 50 years' time? And one of those things is about the culture you build into the organization. You know, post-pandemic, honest comment, I think the pandemic's done nothing more than accelerate these conversations because it's made people wake up because there's a moment. These things were happening anyway. You know, the culture of a business, how organizations operate, whether they're flexible, whether they coalesce around task-based output, where they're located, how they measure performance, is it about output measurement rather than input measurement? All of those kind of debates are now have to happen at speed. And that plays into this whole digitalization program. Because the machines that we're going to rely on, the businesses we're going to rely on, are going to look very, very different, very quickly, and very soon. And if we don't get hold of this digital agenda properly, we're going to lose out. Because this is what is going to drive economic value, human engagement, and what we spend our lives doing. And I just one personal plea, I spend a lot of time in boardrooms, and I'm sick to death of hearing boards saying, oh, we need to recruit a financially illiterate person. There's all this legislation that tells us that we've got to have somebody who's illiterate, finance with the right badge, and can roll their trouser leg up and shake with their left hand in a funny way to chair the audit committee. And yet there isn't a single conversation about how do I put a digital director on the board. There's no legislation, there's no framework, there's no certification, there's no standards. And nobody really says, actually, that's one of the really key skills we've got to have around the board table. Because all of the stuff we just talked about is going to affect every business. And having somebody who knows about this stuff is really, really important. Really important. Probably more important than having somebody who knows how to add up on a spreadsheet. So let's talk a bit about fiber, blah, blah, blah. You know, Graham and the gang, Graham, Dara, John, Kevin. Kevin used to remind me about return on capital employed when we were building the fiber network in Jersey, and was a constant pain in my side, reminding me about that, about why we were doing it. But you know, we are sitting here on the number one, hooray, well done, guys, best connected island, best connected country in the world. Now, it's helped a little bit because we turned up the volume to max during COVID, but do you know what? We built a fabric and an infrastructure that has worked well for this island, was not generally welcomed when we started it. We felt we faced a lot of criticism, but we have put fiber in the ground that today is carrying a gigabit. We're already testing 10. So we have people, Dara's got people that are playing with 10 gigabit connections. And the fiber infrastructure itself is capable of going to, at least on current technology, almost 2,000 times the current capacity that we're delivering to home. So we hopefully ain't digging up the streets that many more times. It's a big investment, and it's paid off. And I think the value to the island is huge. But more on that in a little bit. And you know, it's the same story on mobile. The mobile infrastructure sitting on this island is genuinely second to none. We are probably scraping and using about 2 to 3% of the capacity at the moment. You know, Tim over there, our regulator, regularly tests the power and the output that we do on our masts, very, very rightly so. But if you look at the charts about where we can turn it up to and where we actually use it, the gap is huge. Yes, Tim? So our ability to turn up the volume on the mobile is also huge. And Tim's going to hate me for saying this, but I was sat in a meeting the other day, and it will remain nameless, where somebody actually said to me, yeah, but we need 5G. We must have 5G. Yeah, that's pretty much my reaction. And I said, well, why? What's the big thing about 5G? And they said, because we need it for the hospital. We need 5G for the hospital. Because, 5G is medical stuff and surgery, and it's important. And I didn't even know where to begin. The last thing I would ever do is lay down and let somebody put something on my body over a 5G Wi-Fi mobile connection. I can't even begin to tell you why that's the wrong thing. And the worst thing, again, forgive me for just diving into this a little bit, but the worst thing is that seems to be one of the pervasive arguments at the moment. And the uninformed nature of just that statement from somebody who should know better and is in a position of control, let's put it that way, was breathtaking. Okay? Now, what's next for us? So JT, let's put a JT hat on for 2 seconds. We've done fiber. It's there, it's working, it's great. We've got a few more bits to tidy up on it. 5G is definitely on the agenda. So we have to figure out 5G. We've got a lot of things to think about in terms of rolling out 5G, but it's on the list and we'll get there. Security. I've talked to you a little bit about the importance of that. Jersey has a finance sector which contributes a huge amount to GDP and requires protection. And this is a country with a government that requires protection. So security's right up there. We've got a lot of work to do on that front. It's a constant battle, as I've just shown you, but we have a lot to do. We've also got to do more with gigabit. There's a lot of services and products we've got to put over gigabit, and I'll talk a little bit about that. There's also a lot of stuff we need to do on data, and a personal gripe of mine is that we have a lot of data flying through the island, and we have a lot of data is becoming increasingly important, as we heard from various speakers. But right now, I don't control the .je. I don't have access to .je. I don't create SSL certificates. I don't have digital certificates that I can manage. The .je domain is controlled in Alderney. And I can register a domain name, but that's pretty much it. So as an island, we don't even own our top-level domain. And for those in the software world, you'll just be horrified to know that. And I've also got all of the general movements that are happening in telecoms, which is about moving away from blue kit, that is specialized telecoms equipment that needs a guy with a soldering iron, to general-purpose computers. And again, for containerized services and virtualizing the fabric, so that the big move in telecoms is away from having dedicated equipment to do one particular job and to move that onto general-purpose PC servers that have virtualized components. You'll hear the word software-defined network kicking around the world at the moment, and pretty much we are moving our entire fabric as an industry gradually across to just virtualized components. And that's a huge change, and it's going to take many, many years. But it is a journey we're on, so that the people in our organization don't carry soldering irons, they carry laptops. And they've got coding degrees and not engineering degrees. And that brings us to our last point, because the other thing on the big agenda is how do we get the right talent and the skills. We already do a lot. We invest and we provide funding to pretty much every STEM graduate coming off the island, but it's not enough. And we don't have a source of talent here, we don't have a source of bringing talent, and it's really hard. And all the conversations we've had about the cost of living, the price of housing, and all that kind of stuff, absolutely echo that. Big problem, huge problem. But I can't just do things with gigabit on my own. And the crying shame is if all we do is, do a few Zoom calls and watch Netflix better, that's just shame on us, actually, shame on the people in this room. And when I look at the things that, as an outsider, because I don't live on the island, when I look at things outside, I just can't understand why we're not doing some of these other things. I'm sitting here on an island with beautiful beaches. Environmental technology, monitoring, and projects should be top of the agenda, but I can't see one. I've got the highest tidal flows anywhere. I've got seas that move in and out and all over the place. And yet, the place where we're doing alternative power generation is in Scotland. We're about to build a hospital. I don't want to even go there, but we're about to build a hospital. This is a once in a generation, if not once in several generations opportunity. And to tell me that we need 5G to make this work is just insane. And if we're not wiring this thing up with fiber to do remote surgery, lectures, education, medical training, drugs, I mean, you name it, the amount of medical technology we could stuff this thing with that would benefit Jersey, because there's not many places that build a new hospital. And yet there isn't a single thing, not one thing, in any of the documents I can read about the hospital. Not one thing. The one comment on technology in there, in all of the plans, talks about putting an entertainment system in for patients. EVs. 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, small island. I could drive a car all day, and I wouldn't run out of battery. Why isn't this place full of them? Why do we not have EV charging points everywhere? One of my other companies that I get involved in, and actually Jersey has a disproportionate amount of people from this organization. There's a company called the DCC, which is the company charged with rolling out the smart energy system in the UK. I'm the senior non-independent, non-executive director on that. Your chairman of Andium Homes is the chairman of it, and one of JT's non-execs is the CEO of it. And it is the government £16 billion programme to force smart energy systems onto the entire industry. You've got more expertise on smart energy in what's happening in the UK, in Jersey more often than they're in the UK. Not once has anybody ever spoken to any of us about that. Not once. And we are struggling with how do we roll out 80 million EV points across the UK. I'm flying out tomorrow to Seabays, to the government department that's responsible for that, to talk about exactly that programme. And what I would love to say is, guess what? We've already done it in Jersey. Here's the standard. Here's the way we do it. Look at how this works. We can put this on the domestic tariff bill. There's a nice little app, and guess what? It fits in with the DCC system. I'd love to say that. I can't. Security. This island has a reputation for trust, financial transactions. It has a brand Jersey that goes around that finance world. The finance industry is the ultimate virtual product. Why aren't we doing anything on security? Data escrow. People being able to put data into Jersey that's safe, away from ransomware. We know where it is, it's here. We have a government that can create regulation and controls and systems and quality assurance. We have an infrastructure that can support it, but there isn't a conversation going on. IoT. We have just created one of the world's largest IoT companies. It's sitting there, right there, on island. One of the world's largest IoT companies is sitting on this island. If I landed at the airport, it doesn't say home of Microsoft. It should say home of IoT. And it doesn't. It doesn't. Nobody has had a conversation with us about how do we create an ecosystem around IoT. Little old JT went off, created an IoT business, and made a big success of it. Not a single person in this room ever asked us about it. 5G. We're about to roll 5G. The world is about to roll 5G. We could do that earlier. We could do it quicker. We could come up with 15 use cases for it. Anybody got any ideas? If anybody says hospital, I'm going to thump them. Blockchain. There is a thriving finance community on Jersey. Some people talking about it earlier. I don't understand, and I actually had this conversation with some people last night over dinner, Dave included, about why we don't have a thriving fintech sector. I don't understand. I really don't understand. It can't be that hard. Now, the excuse I got last night, and it's not an excuse, Dave, it's not a grur, was blah, 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 regulation, blah, blah, blah. And when I asked the question and said, is that in our control? The answer was, yes, it is. But it's complex, Phil, and you don't understand. Oh, no, you're right, I probably don't understand, but it can't be that hard to solve because other people are solving it. So why can't we? And the fourth one on there is, back to my point, the world is wrestling with this onslaught of technology and digitalization. We have in this room everybody who is involved in setting standards, governance, corporate law. We've got more finance people, more entrepreneurs, and more big business people in this community than I can shake a stick at, and I can get them in a room at the same time. How do I create standards, corporate governance rules, and why are we not leading the world in that? Why are we not setting the agenda for how to be a digitally certified, trusted business? And I put this chart up quite a lot at some of the companies I've talked to, but you know, if you're talking to me about things that get you 10% growth, that's just about survival right now. If you're talking to me that gets about 100% growth, that's great. That's what I expect in a plan. But if you're not coming to me with wacky ideas that give 10 times growth, we're wasting our time. So how do we get ideas in those areas that are times 10 growth thinking for the economy of Jersey? I'm not about JT. I'm not talking about a particular business or a particular. I'm talking about the economy of Jersey. And if we want some pointers as to one of the things that I think is a problem, why we don't have these conversations, it's because of these issues. And we've mentioned some of them today about talent, education, government policy, just setting a damn direction for where we need to go. Things like security and trust. How do I bless those and manifest them in a digital world in the same way that I do in the financial world today? How do I create pathways? There was a lot of talk earlier about startups. Startups are great, but the world is trying to do startups. How do I get big companies like IBM and Google and Sony to come to the island and trial things? How do I do that? How do I make it easy for those people? How do I make the guys that are, you know, not the funky hippie guys in the coders with the long hair? How do I get the guys who are in their mid-30s, got a couple of kids, started a successful digital business but want to grow it to come here? How do I get those people here? Those people who value the lifestyle here, who can afford some of the housing issues and some of the cost of living issues and are prepared to go through those kind of work. How do I create those kind of pathways? Because we have an infrastructure. We've done the hard bit. You know, when I'm having conversations, particularly Bays tomorrow, we're going to be talking about energy companies and we're going to be talking about EV chargers and the number of energy companies that are going bust. You know, one of the things that they talk about in the EV rollout is we don't have the fibre in the UK, Phil, to support a mass 80 million EV charging point rollout. And they're right. I can't get anything like that capacity in my house in the middle of Yorkshire. Jersey has it. It's done the hard bit. It's the things that stop these conversations happening back home, for me, are already here and done and ticked in the box. And yet, in the 3 years that we've been running Gigabit, we've got nowhere. We've done nothing. And if you're looking for a compelling reason, which was one of the challenges that was put earlier, this island has done remarkably well and created a discontinuity in its population to GDP growth by creating a framework for the finance industry. And it's done that on the back of being self-determined tax regime, a self-legislative environment, and being a small island on the outskirts of the EU. Guess what? It's no longer the small island on the outskirts of the EU. And finance is the ultimate virtual product. It can disappear overnight. And if you want to think about long-term risk and sustainable growth in this island for the next 30 to 50 years, I would not be counting on just the finance sector. So if you want a compelling reason, there's one right there. And if you want an example of the sort of thing, you know, so, Dave, you were talking about separating productivity from physical resource consumption, and you know, how do you create that discontinuity? And that being a challenge for all of us, I'd remind you of a guy called Colin Powell. Some of you might remember this, some of you might not. He sat down several years ago, Kevin, and said, go on. 1970s, there you go, 1970s, in Jersey, and said, how do we create a finance sector in Jersey? How do we attract personal wealth? How do we create trust funds? How do we bring that discontinuity to Jersey? And they sat down with some method and forethought, malice, and created a legislative, regulatory environment that allowed that sector to thrive. And they did it with thought and method and process. And the result is that 40% of GDP plus comes from the finance sector in Jersey today. And that was a handful of people fighting together with a bunch of ideas. And there's a wonderful book about it, and he's written a book. He's passed away recently, unfortunately, but a wonderful book about how he did that, which Kevin can lend you, because it's Kevin has the copy. Why can we not do that for digital? What stops us doing that would be my final challenge to you, because we've done it before, we created discontinuity, we need to create another one. Why can't we follow the method we followed before? I'll leave it at that.